"Are you planning to claim the inheritance?" came a strange call from a notary. And when her husband found out what was coming to her, "Are you planning to claim the inheritance?" The voice on the other end of the line was sharp and impatient. Sherry frowned, trying to grasp what exactly was being demanded of her. "Inheritance? As far as I know, everyone in the family is alive." "Brian Harris, how is he related to you?" sighed the weary voice on the line. "Or have you already forgotten your own father?" "Wait, did he die?" Sherry asked, feeling profoundly awkward. "Exactly. You're inheriting his estate, so kindly make your way to the notary's office. We've been waiting only for you." The weary voice gave her an address, a phone number for inquiries, and office hours. Then the line went dead. Sherry stood there, staring at the phone in shock. She had never had to deal with an inheritance before. At 35 years old, she had no idea what the procedure entailed. And the news of her father's death came as a big surprise. Then again, why should she be shocked? They hadn't seen each other in over 25 years. Sherry closed her eyes and recalled the night her mom and dad had fought before his departure. "You're leaving us," Lisa Peters had screamed. "Trading your family for some pregnant model. I hate you. You're cursed." "Lisa, calm down, please." Brian had tried to reason with her. "What are you doing? You're scaring the child, she's crying. And why should you care about your daughter's tears? You've abandoned us. Go ahead, leave. You're nothing to us now. And take your child support checks and choke on them. I'll raise her myself, and at least she won't grow up breathing in all those damn paint fumes." "What do you even know about it?" Brian had retorted. "I know plenty," Lisa snapped. "I'm an artist, an acclaimed one, not some street painter." "If only your art actually made a difference," her mother had sneered. "You sell one painting a year, and the rest of the time you live off me." "Because I don't have any inspiration." "No muse," her father had protested. "And you're useless," Lisa had shouted, so loudly that the crystal in the cabinet rattled. Her father had really left that night. Sherry never saw him again. But once a year, money would arrive, sometimes more, sometimes less. Of course, the transfers were made out to her mother, who withdrew the funds and bought Sherry whatever she wanted. Occasionally, letters arrived. Sherry never replied to them. In fact, if her mother intercepted them first, she would tear the envelopes and their contents into tiny pieces. In his letters, her father described his life. The last letter came just before Sherry's 18th birthday. Inside, he included a photo of himself standing in a meadow, his arm around the shoulders of a slender, blond young man with a face like it belonged on a medieval icon. Sherry had never seen anyone like him before. On the back of the photo was a caption, "Me with my student, Christopher Jensen." Sherry carefully kept that photo as the last tangible connection she had to her father. That year, the money he sent was especially generous. Her mother added to it and bought Sherry a car. By then, her mother had remarried to the quiet, hard-working Andrew Reyes. Sherry flat out refused to think of him as a replacement for her father, but Andrew turned out to be a decent man. He loved Sherry like his own daughter, never treating her any differently than his sons. Because of his devotion to her mother, whom he deeply admired, Sherry forgave her stepfather for his clumsiness with words and his inability to express feelings. Still, Sherry struggled for years to forgive both of her parents for their divorce, but as she grew older, she came to understand and reevaluate many things. She regretted not saving her father's letters and keeping only the photograph he had sent. She had always wanted to meet him but had no idea how to find his address, making it nearly impossible. Besides, Sherry's own life hadn't turned out to be particularly happy. She enrolled in a teacher training college but managed to complete only 3 years. She never became a teacher. Instead, she met her future husband in a group of friends, Alan Wilson, the brother of one of her girlfriends. Alan was 3 years older, had just graduated from a finance university, rode a motorcycle, and seemed incredibly cool. Sherry fell head over heels in love with him immediately and without hesitation. He struck her as incredibly smart, with a sarcastic way of speaking and mesmerizing green eyes. Sherry didn't think of herself as beautiful and was genuinely surprised when Alan asked her out. They got married, and it quickly became clear that balancing her studies with her husband's wild lifestyle was impossible. Against her mother and stepfather's objections, Sherry dropped out of college. She knew that without a degree, she wouldn't be able to work as a teacher, but she desperately wanted to spend as much time as possible with the man she loved. Soon after, she got pregnant, but that didn't stop her from riding motorcycles with Alan until one day, he lost control. Sherry lost the baby after the accident. The doctors insisted that it was a miracle she survived the blood loss. But even more devastating was the discovery that she would never be able to have children again. In the hospital room, Alan knelt before her and her mother, pleading, "I swear, I'll stop drinking forever, and I'll sell the motorcycle. Please, forgive me." "Alan, stop," Sherry replied. With the loss of their child, her feelings for him vanished entirely. What followed was a deep apathy where it didn't matter who was next to her or what they did. Staring into Alan's unfamiliar, cold face, Sherry often wondered whether he had ever truly loved her at all. Yet they stayed together for years, as if condemned to a slow and painful punishment. 15 years had passed since then. Sherry had returned to work, though not as a teacher, but as a school librarian. She also led an art club, drawing on her education from art school and the encouragement of her father, who had once said she was very talented. She made enough to get by, and her husband contributed to the household budget, though Sherry suspected he wasn't putting in even half of his salary. Alan worked as a financial analyst for a company that built roads and bridges. The projects were big, and the industry had plenty of money. Alan dreamed of climbing the career ladder, but he was so lazy that even his boss would tell him, "Alan, put in some effort. You know the saying, a rolling stone gathers no moss. Why bother?" Alan would smirk. "I'm handling my share of the workload just fine. Only a fool goes looking for extra work on his own." So while more ambitious colleagues who were willing to visit construction sites and pursue new partnerships were promoted, Alan remained stuck in the same position for years, complaining about how little he earned. None of this stopped him from having an affair. Cassandra, a slender brunette with long legs who worked for a company building suburban housing developments, caught his attention at an industry meeting. Alan, still a handsome man, easily won her over. To Sherry, he was condescending, treating her like a lapdog, annoying but familiar, something you wouldn't kick out into the cold. At the notary's office, where the notary unexpectedly turned out to be a woman named Margaret Hill, Sherry learned that her inheritance was quite substantial, a whole house and a village. Margaret helped her file the necessary paperwork, provided instructions about the additional documents she would need to gather, and sent her on her way. Feeling excited, Sherry decided to share the news with her husband, but his reaction was far from supportive. "I don't need your backwoods property, not even for free," he laughed. "A house and some land in some godforsaken place are worth next to nothing. And how do you even plan to get there? Honestly, I wouldn't bother accepting that inheritance." "I'm curious to see what Dad left behind," Sherry replied stubbornly. "Besides, I'll need to put up a gravestone for him." "Well, that's definitely not my problem," Alan scoffed. "Go ahead, knock yourself out if it's so interesting to you. I couldn't care less. That house won't even count in a divorce settlement." "You could at least be happy for me," Sherry sighed. "But fine. Should I expect you home tonight?" "No, I'll be at work," her husband replied dismissively. "And stop treating me like a child, checking if I've eaten, slept, or brushed my teeth. You're not my mom." He left for work, and Sherry started getting ready for her art club. School was on break at the moment, but the club was still running. On her way there, Sherry finally managed to get through to her mother. Lisa and her stepfather Andrew had been deep in the woods on a hiking trip with no cell reception. "Mom, Can you believe it? Dad passed away. He left me a house and some land in his will. 2 whole hectares. But honestly, I don't know what to do with it. Well, who else would he leave it to? Lisa sighed. He was young, though. Probably drank himself to death or had some kind of accident. And Alan mocked you about the inheritance? Sherry sighed. Yeah, he made fun of me. I'm planning to go see the house tomorrow anyway. I need to get the required documents, and I'd at least like to see where Dad lived. You've upset me a little, her mother admitted. No matter what kind of person your father was, he was still a human being. Andrew says he'll make a gravestone for him himself at work. Sherry nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. Her stepfather Andrew was a stonemason who worked with granite and marble, crafting all kinds of items, mostly for interiors, but he occasionally made gravestones. People always said Andrew had golden hands. After saying goodbye to her mother, Sherry arrived at the school and conducted her art class, but her thoughts were so scattered that the kids kept asking her to repeat herself, and no one could focus on the lesson. She went to bed early that night since she'd have to wake up at the crack of dawn. The buses to the village council didn't run often. Meanwhile, her husband was at Cassandra's house. Cassandra hadn't started her affair with Alan purely out of affection. Sometimes, she could glean useful information from him, which she would then share with her boss, earning career advancement in the process. That evening, Cassandra had to endure an hour-long rant from Alan as he ridiculed his wife's inheritance. Can you believe it? Alan sneered. That hen keeps clucking about how the house is a memory of her father. And you know where it is? In the middle of nowhere. There isn't even a proper road there, just a dirt track. Wait, a village near the city? Yeah, Alan agreed. What, are you thinking of buying yourself a little country house there too? No, but I've seen that name in some of the work documents, Cassandra said thoughtfully, walking over to her laptop and opening it. Hold on a second, let me check. Listen to this, it might actually have to be relocated soon, possibly very soon. Haven't you heard? There's ongoing discussion about it. No final decision yet, but there's talk of a toll highway running through that village. That's it. I was wondering where I'd heard that weird name before, Alan laughed. So, my unlucky wife's finally caught a break. Well, you know, if the decision goes through, the land there will skyrocket in value, Cassandra said, shaking her head. Plus, there's a gasification plan for that village too. Honestly, it's a pretty promising area. You know what? We need to convince your wife to sell that house as soon as possible. If everything goes according to plan, we'll make a fortune later. How big is her plot again? 2 hectares? You're so brilliant, Alan said admiringly, his eyes already gleaming with greedy excitement. The next day, everything seemed to go Sherry's way. She quickly gathered the necessary documents and headed off to the village. She was eager to see how her father had lived. From the notary, she had already learned that he had been buried in the local cemetery. On the way, she bought flowers from an elderly woman to place on his grave. There was only one fresh burial there. The plaque bore her father's name and the dates of his life. Sherry laid the flowers on the mound, crouched down, and began to sob bitterly. She didn't even notice when a peculiar-looking old man appeared beside her, dressed for winter despite the warm season, wearing thick clothes, a fur hat, and felt boots. He stood there quietly for a while before clearing his throat gently. Sherry wiped her face and looked up as the man spoke. You must be the daughter of our artist, aren't you? He talked about you all the time, couldn't stop. He even showed us pictures on his phone. Childhood pictures, you mean? Sherry asked, then explained, we hadn't seen each other in ages. No, grown-up ones. From social media, maybe, the old man said with a sigh. I'm his old neighbor, Herbert Santos. Do you have the keys to my father's house? She asked. The notary didn't have any. The artist didn't lock his doors much, Herbert replied. But after he passed, I put a padlock on to protect his belongings. It's quiet around here, But you never know, someone might try to take advantage. We get drifters sometimes, especially in summer. And treasure hunters too. There's an old mine nearby, attracts all sorts of shady folks. It's pretty safe overall, but better to be cautious, in my opinion. Thank you, Herbert, Sherry said with a smile. Want me to walk you there? Herbert offered. By the way, why do you all call my dad an artist? Well, what else would we call him? Herbert chuckled. He put our village on the map. His paintings of the hayfield sold at major exhibitions. He painted plenty of us villagers too. And, oh boy, you'd better not say he was just drawing. He'd have smacked you with a paintbrush for that. Yeah, my dad scolded me for that once when I was a kid too, Sherry smiled. Later, when I went to art school, I learned the difference. Ah, so you're an artist too, Herbert grinned. Takes after her father. I just run an art club, that's all, Sherry clarified. Your dad isn't buried here by chance, you know, Herbert continued his story. The chapel here? It was built based on his design and with his funds. That's why we're protesting against this cursed road. According to their plans, it'll cut right through our homes and the cemetery. Can you imagine disturbing the dead like that? Sherry sighed but didn't press him further. By then, they had reached the house. Herbert handed her the key to the lock. Sherry stepped through the gate, walking past a well-maintained but slightly overgrown garden, and saw the house with its colorful carved window frames painted in wild, vibrant hues. One wall was yellow, another crimson, and the third blue. The door gleamed in malachite green, while a red roof capped the kaleidoscope of shades, making it seem as though her father had simply used whatever leftover paint he had. Sherry unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was simple, a couch and a couple of armchairs in the living room, a small bedroom with a single bed and a table, and a larger room that served as a studio. The walls were lined with paintings. Most of them featured Sherry's face, and on another canvas, she recognized the young man from the photograph, Christopher Jensen. In the corner, primed canvases were stacked, and paints and brushes were laid out on the table as if the artist had just stepped out and would be back at any moment. Without realizing it, Sherry had started calling her father the artist too. She also realized she hadn't asked Herbert about the cause of her father's death. The house didn't hold much of particular interest aside from the paintings, but Sherry dutifully sorted through her father's belongings and eventually found a photo album. The pictures were old, about a decade old, and in all of them, her father was with Christopher. The slender young man had grown into a mature adult, still with the same soulful, almost iconic gaze. Locking up the house again, Sherry went to return the key to Herbert. However, the old man refused to take it, telling her he had a spare. It was then that she asked, "How did my father die?" "Didn't they tell you?" Herbert raised an eyebrow. Though, honestly, who would bother? Around here, we think those highway lobbyists drove him to his death, or even killed him outright. He fought them tooth and nail, not afraid of anyone. But officially, they said it was a heart attack. Happened right there in the cemetery. There were vandals causing trouble, and he was trying to catch them. That's where they found him, between the graves. But his mobile phone was missing. And let me tell you, Brian never went anywhere without his phone. Is that why you suspect it was murder? Sherry asked. There's something new here every day, arsons, strange incidents, all sorts of chaos. We're scared to live here now, that's the truth, Herbert sighed. Let me give you some advice. If you ever decide to move here, insure the house first. My hunch is it's an inside job, our own people, not strangers. Not everything is as peaceful as it seems. Nodding, Sherry made her way to the bus stop. She had already made up her mind, she would claim the inheritance and keep the house. Let her husband mock her all he wanted. On her way to the stop, Sherry noticed a small boy, around 5 years old, running around alone. The child looked neglected and skinny. Her heart ached. Sherry would never have children of her own. She returned to the city and found Alan home unusually early. He greeted her amicably. Well, did you check out your inheritance? Tell me about it. You must be tired, right? I suggest we have dinner at a restaurant. We can also toast to your father and you can share everything. All right, Sherry nodded, surprised by this unexpected turn of events. Let me freshen up, and then we can go. Of course, Alan didn't take her to the upscale restaurant where he usually dined with Cassandra. Instead, he reserved a table at a modest family-style eatery with affordable prices. Still, Sherry rarely went out to such places, and she was delighted to spend an evening outside the house. As they sat at their table, Alan brought up the topic again. So, what's the house like? Big? What's there, in general? It's more of an artist's workshop than a home, Sherry smiled. There are lots of Dad's paintings, mostly with my face on them. Yeah, your father's preferences were peculiar, Alan scoffed. By the way, don't take too long with the house. I happen to learn that a major highway is planned to cut through that village. Not exactly an ideal spot to live. So, finish the paperwork and sell it off, or you'll only get a pitiful compensation at the cadastral value, or worse, the land could be seized for next to nothing, and you'll be left with peanuts. But it's a memory of my dad, Sherry responded stubbornly, pressing her lips together. Look, Alan said, growing irritated, do you think your father would be happy in the afterlife knowing his daughter lost out on his legacy? At least this way, you'll get something out of it. I'm just trying to look out for you. I don't know, Sherry replied. What if the road construction doesn't happen? The locals are protesting it pretty strongly. Don't be so naive, Alan sneered. No one cares about a handful of villagers. Let them protest all they want. Their houses might just conveniently burn down, and that'll be the end of it. The ashes can be bought up for pennies. It's not like it'd be the first time. What? Do you do things like that? Sherry stared at him, wide-eyed. Of course not, Alan shook his head. Personally, I don't get involved in stuff like that, but there are other companies out there that play much rougher. What Alan didn't mention was that such jobs usually went to entirely different kinds of people. His wife might be naive and gullible, but she could still say something in the wrong place, causing problems. After that conversation, Sherry withdrew into herself. They quickly finished their dessert, and even the drive home was silent. Despite the tension, Alan did everything that evening to make amends with his wife. But Sherry was hesitant to forgive him. Something in his words had unsettled her deeply. The next day, during his lunch break, Alan met with Cassandra. She was eager to hear how things went with his wife, but the results didn't impress her much. What's the matter? Is it so hard for you to mess with her head a little? You always say Sherry's just a naive little lamb, desperate for her husband's attention. So give her what she wants. Don't you see? If we can get that house without any trouble, the rest of the village will be even easier to deal with. There's a massive contract at stake here. I could buy 3 villages like that just from the kickbacks, and you won't be left out either, Alan said, trying to reassure Cassandra. All right, I get it. I'll work on it, he promised, spurred on by his lover's enthusiasm. Just give me a little time. Sherry will be eating out of my hand. Good, Cassandra smirked, ruffling his hair. Will a month be enough to wrap everything up? Of course, Alan replied nonchalantly. Don't worry. Consider the house already in your pocket. As he spoke to his mistress, Alan's thoughts wandered to how much money he could pocket from the deal. Lately, his financial situation had been far from ideal. Cassandra loved expensive restaurants, lavish gifts, and high-end entertainment, and Alan had drained the family account and borrowed significant sums from acquaintances just to keep up with her lifestyle. He had no way to repay his debts, and any financial windfall would be a lifesaver. Meanwhile, Cassandra returned to the office and confidently addressed her boss, Glenn Briggs, in front of her team. By the way, about that village. I can improve our chances of securing the property purchases there. There's an opportunity to cheaply acquire 2 hectares of land in one go. Are you interested, Glenn? Oh, if you pull that off for us, you'll have my deputy's chair in no time. Glenn promised enthusiastically. What's the property? The one the artist lived in, Cassandra replied with a sly smile. Ah, excellent news! Glenn exclaimed, visibly pleased. That man was the reason all our negotiations there stalled. He stirred up such chaos in his little village, practically a rebellion. It's a good thing he conveniently dropped dead from a heart attack, or he'd still be giving us trouble. Dealing with the heirs will surely be easier. The house itself doesn't matter, we're only interested in the land. Honestly, I'd pay anything for a pile of ashes right now. Glenn glanced around the room, then motioned Cassandra to follow him into his office. Tell me, since you've got an in with the heirs, do you have their contact details? Give me a phone number or an address where I can reach them. I'd prefer to handle it myself, Cassandra muttered, but Glenn was firm. This isn't your level of negotiation, he said bluntly. Let's each stick to what we're good at, or we'll end up with chaos everywhere. Fine, all right, I'll get the number, Cassandra relented, frantically texting Alan. Thankfully, he responded immediately, sending the contact information. Here, write it down. That same day, Glenn called Sherry to discuss buying her house and land. However, she refused to listen to him. Glenn, undeterred, insisted on meeting her in person. He was confident his charm could persuade her to sell. Meanwhile, Sherry continued working on finalizing her inheritance. The notary required a fee to process the paperwork, but when she checked their joint accounts, there were mysteriously no funds available. She had to borrow money from her mother and stepfather to pay the necessary amount. She chose not to tell Alan about the transfer of ownership, as she didn't like the growing attention surrounding her inheritance. Sherry also insured her newly acquired property, taking an appraiser to the house. The appraiser was particularly interested in the paintings, and they even required a consultation with an art expert. Once again, her mother and stepfather provided the money for the insurance. The insurance agent strongly recommended that Sherry place the paintings in a secure vault or donate them to a museum. It turned out that in the last couple of years, Sherry's father had become a rather fashionable and sought-after artist. Alan, realizing that his wife was avoiding discussions about selling the property, found himself caught between two fires. On one side was Cassandra, demanding results, eager to climb the career ladder as quickly as possible. On the other side of this strange triangle was Sherry, oblivious to her husband's affair or his plans, and stubbornly unwilling to sell her inherited property. Tired of waiting, Alan decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove to Alkafka to see what was happening there and easily found the artist's house using the description Sherry had given during their first dinner after her trip. To his surprise, he discovered an unexpected occupant on the property, a homeless man sleeping in a hammock under an apple tree. "Hey, what are you doing here? Who the hell are you?" Alan rudely woke him up. "I'm just staying here, I've got nowhere else to go," replied the man. He didn't seem very old, but he looked pitiful, dressed in rags with sandals on his feet. His unkempt shoulder-length hair and graying beard were tangled into a mess. Only his bright, sad eyes betrayed any sign of life. "Got it. Well, I've got a job for you, you can earn some cash. And you can stay here for now, with my permission." "I'm the new owner," Alan lied to the drifter. "I thought the owner was a woman," the homeless man mumbled hesitantly. "Well, yeah, she's my wife," Alan smirked. "And let's skip the introductions. No need for names in this kind of arrangement. The less you know, the better." "That's for sure," the drifter nodded. "So, what's the job?" "Burn the house down," Alan said with a smile, "to the ground. Better do it now while the nights are dark and no one's around. And no gasoline, no evidence of arson." "All right," the homeless man nodded. "I'll do it, but I need the money up front." Alan counted out the requested sum and quickly left before it got completely dark. He had parked his car on the road outside the village, far enough away, and now worried that it might be broken into or stolen. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and he drove away safely, as though he had never been there. Back home, Alan struck up a conversation with Sherry. So, how's the inheritance coming along? It's fine. I've sorted it out. I'm not selling, Sherry replied curtly. I want to spend a month there until the end of the summer, just need to sort things out with work first. You should get that little house insured, Alan sighed with feigned concern. What if it burns down or gets robbed? At least you get some compensation. Thanks for the idea, Sherry nodded, not admitting that she had already taken care of it. Don't put it off. Nights are dark right now, and it's a remote area. Drifters sneak in, and then houses burn down, Alan advised. And how do you know what it's like there? Sherry asked suspiciously. Oh, I've been there for work, so I know, Alan replied, but his answer didn't seem to convince her. Christopher, as agreed, began his mission a few nights later. Armed with kerosene meant for lighting stoves, he approached the house, ready to set it ablaze. But just as he was about to ignite the fire, he caught sight of a terrified child's face staring at him through the window. Who are you? And what are you doing here? Christopher exclaimed, startled. You can't just sneak into houses like this, it's bad. But I know you, mister, the boy suddenly said. You're a friend of the artist, Christopher. But he died, and now he doesn't live here anymore. I know that, Christopher sighed. But no one needs to know about me. Now tell me, why are you hiding out here all by yourself? My mom died, the boy replied with a heavy sigh. I've only got my stepdad now, but he doesn't care. There's no other family. What's your name? Christopher asked, softening. Victor, the boy smiled faintly. I'm almost 6. Next year I'll start school. They say they give you lunches there, milk and porridge. I haven't had porridge even once since Mom died. And how did you get into the house? Christopher asked. I stole the key from Uncle Herbert, Victor admitted. He sleeps real deep with earplugs in. I already put the key back so he wouldn't notice. Well, good for you, Christopher said with a small smile. Don't worry, kid. Let's cook something to eat, but we'll do it over a campfire. I've got a pot. Christopher prepared a simple meal of buckwheat porridge with canned meat and tea. After feeding Victor, he put the boy to sleep, covering him with the artist's old quilted jacket. The next morning, Christopher led the boy to the woods, where he had built a sturdy little shelter back in the spring. It was a bit hot in summer due to the fur-lined coverings on the roof, but it was hidden from the locals, who avoided the area out of fear of encountering escaped prisoners or shady characters from nearby gold mines. When Alan didn't hear any news about the fire, he grew impatient and returned to the village. He found Christopher digging up young potatoes in the garden. What the hell is this? Alan fumed. What, you think this is some kind of vacation resort on my dime? Why is the house still standing? Here, take your money back, Christopher said quietly, holding out the cash. I've changed my mind. I don't want to be a criminal. Oh, is that so? Alan said, furious. Fine, but know this, if you say one word about me to anyone, they'll find you burned to a crisp. Christopher stared at him silently with those strange, piercing eyes. Suddenly, an enormous, disheveled man stumbled into the garden, drunk and aggressive. He charged at Christopher. You stole my boy, the man roared. Social services are coming tomorrow, and you'd better give him back, or I'll kill you, I swear. Don't you threaten me, Christopher shot back, standing his ground. And stop beating the kid. Maybe then he won't feel the need to run away. Ha, the stepfather, John, laughed darkly. Sure thing. Now get out of here. And remember, I warned you, next time I see you, I'll break your legs. Christopher hurried off the property, leaving Alan standing awkwardly with John, the crumpled cash still in his hand. Alan looked up at the towering man before him, his mind racing. Do you want to make some money? Alan asked. My guy bailed and ran off. What do you need? John rumbled. Can't you see I've been sick since yesterday? Not really up for work today. You won't have to do much, Alan laughed. Just burn this house down. Oh, that's easy, John laughed heartily. In fact, I've been wanting to do that for a while. You have no idea how much this damn house has annoyed me. Ever since my wife died, I've been raising the kid, getting on his case, making sure he doesn't go astray. But he's not even mine, she had him with someone else while I was in prison. I gave her a little lesson for that. But she died herself, no one could prove I hit her. Here, take the money, Alan said, handing him the bills. Just make sure it's done right, and do it quickly. Wait for it. Tonight it'll burn like a torch, the big man chuckled. Since I don't need to find the kid anymore, I'll get to work. Who exactly are you, by the way? The client? Just a well-wisher, Alan smirked. You can consider me someone who brought a little money for you to recover and heal. If you do this cleanly, I'll give you more. He hurried off the yard, eager to get to his car. But he hadn't realized that Herbert had been listening to their conversation. He'd planned to stand guard that night, but had fallen asleep while watching the evening news on TV. Age had caught up with him. Meanwhile, Christopher's conscience was uneasy. He knew Alan would find another guy to do the job. And his heart ached for little Victor. It was clear the child couldn't keep wandering forever. So Christopher started asking him questions. Do you have any other relatives besides your stepdad? No one, the boy sighed. And I don't want to go to an orphanage. But it's awful with my stepdad. Last month, he almost broke my arm and promised to throw me off the roof. I'm scared. Listen, wasn't your mom somehow related to the artist? Christopher asked. I think she was his illegitimate daughter. I don't know, Victor said, puzzled. If he was my grandfather, why didn't he take me in? He paused. No, that's nonsense. The boy yawned widely, clearly exhausted. Christopher tucked him into the old mattress, covered him with a jacket, and left him to sleep while he went to the artist's house. He planned to take a decent blanket and find a photo of Victor's mother. But once inside, after grabbing the blanket, Christopher suddenly felt like something was off. As he searched for the photo album, the rooms began filling with pungent smoke. He rushed to the exit, but the artist's paintings had already caught fire in the studio. He couldn't let them burn. Grabbing a bucket, he ran to the well. And then he did it again and again. By the time the firefighters arrived, Herbert had already called them, and they found Christopher running around with a bucket, not even realizing his face and hands were badly burned. The firefighters indirectly blamed the vagrant for starting the fire and left, promising to return later when the owner arrived. Christopher was taken to the hospital with severe burns, while John, convinced he had completed the task, went off to drink with friends from the neighboring village. The next morning, Victor woke up all alone in the shelter and went out to look for food. He stumbled upon Herbert, who took the boy in and fed him. Sherry, upon waking up, saw her husband sitting with a satisfied expression, watching the news. They were talking about a fire in the village. Sherry rushed out of the house, not noticing the satisfied smile spreading across Alan's face. He was confident that now his wife would finally agree to sell that cursed piece of land, and Alan would receive the money from his mistress as thanks for closing the deal. Sherry took her car, which had been rusting in the garage, even though she had refused to drive for years, not to mention motorcycles, after that ill-fated accident. She was eager to get to the village as quickly as possible and arrived there in no time. After all, her stepfather Andrew had kept the car in perfect condition. He had always hoped that one day Sherry would muster the courage to drive again. In the village, as soon as her car stopped at the gate, Herbert ran up to her. Together, they walked through the aftermath of the fire. The annex and part of the roof over the porch had suffered the most. That was where the arson had taken place. In the workshop, paints and solvents had burned. Some walls were blackened with soot, and many canvases were destroyed. However, 2 paintings had been saved, both depicting Sherry. The rest had not been spared by the flames. Herbert eagerly recounted the events, mentioning the visit of a mysterious man who had commissioned the arson, as well as a vagabond who had saved the paintings. The only thing is, I don't know his name, the old man sighed. His face looks familiar, but I just can't remember who he is. I know, Victor piped up as he ran toward them. His name is Christopher, and he saved me from my stepfather. Oh, really? Sherry asked. Then we need to find him. Which hospital was he taken to? Herbert gave her the address and explained how to get there. He also handed her a report from the firefighters. On the way, Sherry stopped by the fire station and completed the necessary paperwork. When someone suggested that the arsonist might have been the vagabond, she stated firmly that there was a witness and that an entirely different person was responsible for setting the house on fire. The firefighters promised to investigate. At the hospital, Sherry spent a long time searching for Christopher. At first, they wouldn't let her see him, so she had to pretend to be his fiancé. Finally, she made it to his room and stared at the bandaged figure before her. Christopher was covered in gauze, with an 4 in his thigh because his hands were unusable. Yet he was conscious and even managed to speak. Well, hello, girl from the portraits, he smirked. I thought we wouldn't meet again. Hello, boy from the photograph, Sherry mimicked him. So, I gather you were closer to my dad than a son would have been? Why, then, is the house bequeathed to me? You're his biological daughter, and Brian felt guilty, Christopher whispered. But that doesn't matter right now. If I suddenly die, look at the back of the photo in the album. You have it, don't you? And take care of Victor. He's your nephew by blood, or at least I think so. The boy's mother was the illegitimate child of the artist and his model. Tell me, though, what was really going on in the house, and why did you end up on the streets? Sherry asked. Did you never have a home of your own? I grew up in a monastery. I wanted to become an icon painter, Christopher sighed. But then the monastery was shut down, the icons were distributed among other monasteries, and I became an apprentice to your father. Over time, I became his right hand. Brian was nearly blind and stubbornly refused to have cataract surgery. He thought it gave him a unique edge, a blind artist, how unusual. So, I did everything around the house, but I knew about the will. When the artist passed away, I just left. I wasn't the rightful owner of the house. You could have waited to talk to me, Sherry complained. She listened to his version of the arson but was certain that her husband's competitors were behind this dishonest scheme. So, after leaving Christopher in the care of the doctors and reassuring him on all other matters, Sherry drove to the city. Before that, she called Herbert, with whom she had exchanged phone numbers just in case, and strictly forbade him from letting Victor go anywhere. She was worried that the boy's stepfather, now on the run, might decide to eliminate any witnesses. After that, she called Glenn. So, you've decided to play dirty, huh? Are you really willing to pay with a human life for that lousy road? Or will this be the first victim in your disgusting game? What are you talking about? Glenn replied indignantly. Explain, I don't get it. Your employees came to the village to hire an arsonist, right? Sherry asked. By the way, where did you even get my contact info? I guarantee I didn't send anyone, Glenn answered. Actually, call me back in an hour, and I'll ask my subordinate where she got your number. But I think she said she knew the husband of the owner. Fine, no need for an interrogation, sighed Sherry. Looks like it's clear now. Just so you know, I'm not selling that house, even if you burn it to the ground and flatten it with bulldozers. My father lived there, and I will too. You know, your stories are giving me chills, Glenn replied. Looks like I'll have to abandon the idea of building on other people's graves. To be honest, I never liked that project. Most likely, the construction will take place elsewhere. The locals are getting very active there. Sherry hung up, satisfied with the conversation. A lot of things became clear to her. Her husband's absences, his change in mood, and his constant urging to sell the house. It was obvious that Alan had his own interests in this, and there was clearly a mistress involved, deep in the scheme as well. Suddenly struck by an idea, she called Herbert again and asked him to describe the visitor and the arson client. He gave a detailed verbal portrait, and there was no longer any doubt. Her own husband wanted to deprive her of her inheritance. Sherry drove home. As she was getting out of the car, she bumped into Alan at the entrance. Seeing her behind the wheel, Alan asked, stunned, "When did you start driving again? Is that all you care about? Don't you want to know how the person who survived the fire you ordered feels?" Sherry exclaimed. But her husband just smirked. "Do you have any proof?" Alan asked. "Keep in mind, no one will believe a vagrant." "He didn't see you and describe you," Sherry replied. She was afraid her husband would finish off Christopher in the hospital. "I didn't know I've been living with a real monster all these years." "Oh, stop it," Alan laughed. "What now? Are you going to run off to your mom to cry?" "I'm going to the village," Sherry pushed him out of the way. "Let me pass, I need to gather my things." "If you leave now, I'll file for divorce," Alan declared. But Sherry simply ignored him and walked toward the door. She packed her things, left the keys on the table, grabbed her father's old photo album, and headed for the village. Before nightfall, she and Herbert aired out the house and painted the studio walls. Fortunately, Herbert had once worked at a paint factory and had stocked up on supplies. Victor slept under a blanket on the couch. He was well fed again, and the child kept drifting into a doze. Sherry moved the paint roller and thought about what her future would be like. It wasn't until morning that she remembered Christopher's words about the photo album, which had sounded like a will. She flipped over all the photos and found the inscription "My youngest daughter" on a picture of her father holding a little girl. The girl in the photo looked no older than Victor and resembled him strongly. Sherry decided to stay in the village. School was on vacation anyway, and there was nothing keeping her in the city. Alan filed for divorce through a simplified process, without children or property division. That suited her just fine. Christopher was recovering in the hospital, though his face, head, and hands, where the hair had been, were severely burned. During her next visit, the attending doctor stopped her. "Is this person important to you?" "Yes, of course," Sherry replied without hesitation. "Then I recommend finding money for reconstructive surgery so we can repair him after the burns. It's expensive, but there are excellent technologies available now." "I'll find it," Sherry promised. "When do you need it?" "The main things have already been done in an emergency," Dr. Ralph Hawkins answered. "Scarring will form over the next year, and we can operate on that later. We can fix the hands and eyelids in about 4 months, but we need the money." "I understand, thank you," Sherry replied. "And how is his overall condition?" "Our prognosis is positive. Thanks to the witness who called an ambulance in time, it saved your fiancé's life." Sherry said goodbye to the doctor and started working on the house insurance claim. In general, the fire was declared arson, and the investigation was ongoing. John returned and continued harassing the boy, but Victor kept running to Herbert and Sherry. When the insurance payout finally came through, the lost paintings were valued the highest. The artist's daughter paid for Christopher's reconstructive surgeries in advance, and with the remaining money, she started doing small repairs. But there was still one more thing. One morning, Sherry called little Victor into the car and offered to take him to the city. There, the child had a sample taken, just like Sherry did. A week later, the results came back, and Sherry took them first to the child welfare authorities and then to court. A month later, Victor was placed with his blood relative, his aunt. The stepfather was forgotten like a bad dream. Sherry personally went to pick up the child's documents and belongings from his house, and John sneered maliciously, mocking her. "Well, now you get to deal with this good-for-nothing," he grumbled. "Just more losses, no profit. You'll see, he'll start running away from you too. He's like his mother, it's in his blood." "If you've forgotten, let me remind you, Victor and I are of the same blood," Sherry snapped, glaring. By the way, how did you set the fire, kerosene, or did you pick something else? You trying to catch me, huh? John laughed louder. You can't prove anything. I'm not going back to prison, and anyway, think about your little nephew. Kids are so fragile, trusting. Who knows, he might get lost in the woods, and we have a swamp out there. You wouldn't even find his bones. Sherry rushed home and strictly forbade Victor from going anywhere except his yard and the neighbors. He just shrugged. In the fall, Sherry started taking him to her school to begin first grade. Christopher was finally discharged from the hospital and was preparing for his first reconstructive surgery. In the meantime, as the scarring process went on, he worked on repairs. His burned hands were still very difficult to control, but Christopher managed even with the small tasks. He also grew close to Sherry's stepfather, Andrew. He promised to take the guy on after his recovery, but since progress was slow, and Christopher didn't know how to be a freeloader, he began doing small repairs on equipment and other tasks around the yard and garden. In a short time, he became almost indispensable to the local grandmothers. They paid him with cottage cheese, milk, sour cream, and eggs, and gave him meat and vegetables for his work. Sherry joked that she had forgotten how to buy groceries. Now, though, John was losing all those orders from the locals, which he used to do. He walked around sober but angry. One day he showed up at one of his former clients and directly asked what the problem was. Well, Christopher does it better and faster, and he's even a cripple, the woman sighed. And you, big guy, take the money and drink it away. You wasted all your talent, now don't blame others. Oh, come on. What can that pup do with his burned hands? John snapped. You'll be sorry. When Christopher's gone, where will you run? To me for help? Then we'll talk, and I'll charge you new prices. What are you crowing about, like it's awake? The woman said indignantly. Go sleep it off, you've drunk all your brain cells away. John left her yard but held even more bitterness toward Christopher, already formulating a plan to get rid of the rival. To carry out his plan, he needed Victor. John waited for the boy in the yard and told him that Sherry was stuck on the road and needed help. Victor rushed to the crossroads, forgetting all the instructions, and John, walking into the yard, called out to Christopher. Well, hello, handyman. Did you see where your boy ran off to? It's not really my business, but he went straight toward the swamp, zigzagging like a rabbit. John continued to fabricate. The swamp? Why didn't you stop him? Christopher asked, alarmed, and rushed after him. How would I know? Maybe you sent him there for cranberries, John sneered. Wait, I'll go with you. We'll find him faster together. They ventured deeper into the woods, toward a very old swamp hidden in the thicket. Many had perished in its treacherous mud, and now John was leading Christopher right there. At some point, John shouted, There! I see him. Let's go that way. Where? Christopher turned carelessly toward the direction John pointed and felt a sharp push in his back, then started sinking into the swamp. There you go. Thought you could ruin my life, huh? John said with a moralizing tone, quickly stepping away from the swamp. The boy had probably already returned and raised the alarm. Now, John had to carefully play out the second part of his plan and make sure no one reached the swamp before it was too late. He found himself in the village and began making noise to attract attention. Soon, Sherry arrived and heard the terrible news from John. Christopher drowned in the swamp, explained Victor's former stepfather. You see, he ran right in. I shouted at him, told him there were marshes, but he just kept going, like a springbok. I chased after him, but by the time I got there, all I could see was his arm sticking out. You're lying. Little Victor shouted. Christopher knows that swamp better than most. He couldn't have fallen there. Oh, come on. Who's the smart one here? John snapped. You can go check, but you'll have to dive to find the body. Anyone brave enough? You could use some help, a mocking voice came from behind John. The police are already here. And here, please, is my murderer. Sherry jumped and saw Christopher. Realizing all his plans had failed, John began to babble, revealing everyone involved, the one who ordered the attempt on Sherry's father, who turned out to be the director of the company where her husband's mistress worked, and the person who had arranged the house arson. The police were busy taking statements from everyone. John was taken away to the station, with Christopher assured that the one who had tried to kill him wouldn't remain free for long. Sherry breathed a sigh of relief. Now she no longer had to worry about Victor, who had been constantly threatened by his former stepfather. Together with Christopher, she returned home, and there Sherry was finally able to ask about what happened in the swamp. When John pushed me, I immediately ran toward the village, but I started searching for something to grab onto, Christopher explained. I got hold of a strap on a backpack tied to a tree. I used it to pull myself out into the light. Look, the backpack is very old and rotting. It barely held me. What's inside? Sherry asked. Why did you even bring it into the house? Because it's gold. Christopher laughed. There's at least 1 kilogram of it, for sure. Looks like we're rich. No way. Sherry exclaimed. What are your plans now? Marry me, Christopher asked. I've lived with the artist for so many years, always admiring you in the portraits and photos, thinking, this is the perfect woman. Oh, you're overestimating me, Sherry smiled. Well, I'll agree if you tell me why you saved the paintings. Well, you're in them, Christopher smiled. And honestly, the studio in that house is the most valuable thing. What else could I save? They both laughed. Christopher didn't immediately sell all the gold. He sold it little by little, and in the meantime, he gradually regained his strength. He and Sherry got married in the winter. The newlyweds were driven by a team of horses along an unpaved road. In the spring, Christopher decided he wanted to try beekeeping. They bought hives and everything necessary for the apiary. At the same time, the house was undergoing major repairs, with roof replacement planned. Christopher did a lot of the work himself, but after the surgeries, his abilities were somewhat limited, so they had to hire a crew. Over the winter, Sherry became interested in making Brinza cheese, and Christopher gave her a cheese-making facility as a gift. They built it in the former shed next to the house. Soon, it became clear why Sherry had developed a craving for salty and spicy food. She was expecting a baby, and the news only added to the string of happy events. In the fall, the family was expecting a little one. Victor was very hopeful it would be a boy, a playmate and friend, although he'd be happy with a girl as well. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.